This small Japanese fleet, however, provided the Japanese with naval supremacy in their home waters because of an agreement not to build new fortifications or naval bases within striking distance of Japan. The same 10-10-6 ratio of capital ships was also applied to aircraft carriers. France and Italy were brought into the agreements by granting them one-third as much tonnage as the two greatest naval powers in those two categories of vessels. The two categories themselves were strictly defined and thus limited. Capital ships were combat vessels of from 10,000 to 35,000 tons, displacement with guns of not over 16 inches, while carriers were to be limited to 27,000 tons each with guns of no more than 6 inches. The five great naval powers were to have capital ships and carriers as follows. Now we have a table. I will not read it exactly, but I will refer to Tragedy at Home, page 298. So country has a ratio of 5, Britain has a ratio of 5, Japan has a ratio of 3, and France and Italy 1.67. These limits were to be achieved by 1931. This required that 76 capital ships, built or projected, be scrapped by that date. Of these, the United States scrapped 15 built and 13 building, or 28. The British Empire scrapped 20 built and 4 building, or 24. And Japan scrapped 10 built and 14 building, or 24. The areas in which new fortifications in the Pacific were forbidden included A. All United States possessions west of Hawaii, B. All British possessions east of 110 degrees east longitude except Canada, New Zealand and Australia with its territories, and C. All Japanese possessions except the home islands of Japan. Among the 6 treaties and 13 resolutions made at Washington during the 6 weeks of the conference November 1921 to February 1922 were a 9-power treaty to maintain the integrity of China, an agreement between China and Japan over Shantung, another between the United States and Japan over the mandated Pacific Islands, and an agreement regarding the Chinese customs. In consequence of these, the Anglo-Japanese Treaty of 1902 was ended, and Japan evacuated eastern Siberia. Efforts to limit other categories of vessels at Washington failed because of France. This country had accepted equality with Italy in capital ships only on the understanding that its possession of lesser vessels would not be curtailed. France argued that it needed a larger navy than Italy because it had a world empire, which Italy did not, and required protection of its home coasts both in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean, while Italy could concentrate its navy in the Mediterranean. The same objections led both of these powers to refuse the American invitation to the Geneva Disarmament Conference of 1927. The Geneva Conference of 1927 tried to limit other categories of vessels beyond capital ships and carriers. It failed because of a violent dispute between Britain and the United States regarding cruisers. The United States, with few offshore bases and a high seas neighbor, wanted heavy cruisers of about 10,000 tons each, carrying 18-inch guns. 18 guns. The British, with many scattered naval bases, wanted many light cruisers of 7,500 tons each, with 6-inch guns, and were eager to limit heavy cruisers in order to increase the naval importance of their million tons of fast merchant ships which could be armed with 6-inch guns in an emergency. The United States accepted the British division of cruisers into two classes, but asked for limitation of both in accordance with the Washington ratios and with the lowest possible maximum tonnage. Britain wished to limit only heavy cruisers and fixed her own absolute cruiser needs at 70 vessels, aggregating 562,000 tons, or twice the total suggested by the Americans. The British argued that their cruiser needs had nothing to do with the relative size of the American cruiser fleet, but depended on such absolute values as the size of the Earth and the miles of shipping lanes to be patrolled. On this point, Winston Churchill was adamant, and was able to force the chief British delegate to the Geneva Conference, Lord Robert Cecil, who wanted to compromise, to resign from the cabinet. The conference broke up in a recriminatory atmosphere, to the great joy of the lobbyists of shipbuilding companies and patriotic societies. These had harassed the delegates throughout the conference. 3 American shipbuilding companies stood to lose contracts worth almost $54 million if the conference had been a success, and they did not hesitate to spend part of that sum to ensure that it would not be a success. Later, they were sued for more money by their chief lobbyist at the conference, Mr. William B. Shearer. As a sequel to the conference, Britain signed a secret agreement with France, by which France promised to support Britain against the United States on the cruiser and other issues, and Britain promised to support France in preventing limitation of trained infantry reserves at the approaching World Disarmament Conference. This agreement, signed in July 1928, was revealed by pro-American employees of the French Foreign Ministry to William Randolph Hearst, and published in his newspapers within 2 months of its signature. France deported the Hearst reporter in Paris at once, deported Hearst himself on his next visit to France in 1930, and published the text of the agreement with Britain in October 1928. The London Naval Conference of 1930 was able to reach the agreement which Geneva had failed to achieve. The publicity about Shearer's activities and about the Anglo-French agreement, as well as the arrival of the world depression and the advent of a more pacifist Labour government to office in London, contributed to this success. Cruisers, destroyers, and submarines were defined and limited for the 3 greatest naval powers, and certain further limitations were set in the categories fixed at Washington. The agreements were as follows in tons. Now we have a table. So US would have 180,000 tons of heavy cruisers with guns over 6.1 inches. Britain would have 146.8 thousand tons, and Japan would have 108.4 thousand tons. Light cruisers were to be 143.5 thousand tons for the US, 192.2 thousand tons for Britain, and 100.45 thousand tons for Japan. There will be destroyers, 150,000 for the USA, 150,000 for Britain, and 105.5 thousand for Japan. And everybody will have a right to the same amount of submarines, 52.7 thousand tons. This allowed the United States to have 18 heavy cruisers, Britain 15, and Japan 12, while in light cruisers the 3 figures would allow about 25, 35, and 18. Destroyers were limited to at 1.85 thousand tons each with 5.1-inch guns, and submarines to 2,000 tons each with 5.1-inch guns. This settlement kept the Japanese fleet where it was, forced Britain to reduce, and allowed the United States to build, except in regard to submarines. Such a result could probably have been possible only at a time when Japan was in financial stringency and Britain was under a Labour government. This treaty left unsolved the rivalry in the Mediterranean between Italy and France. Mussolini demanded that Italy have naval equality with France, although his financial straits made it necessary to limit the Italian navy. The claim to equality on such a small basis could not be accepted by France in view of the fact that it had two seacoasts, a worldwide empire, and Germany's new 10,000-ton pocket battleships to consider. The Italian demands were purely theoretical, as both powers, for motives of economy, were under treaty limits and making no effort to catch up. France was willing to concede Italian equality in the Mediterranean only if it could get some kind of British support against the German Navy in the North Sea, or could get a general non-aggression agreement in the Mediterranean. These were rejected by Britain. However, Britain succeeded in getting a French-Italian naval agreement as a supplement to the London Agreement, March 1931. By this agreement, Italy accepted a total strength of 428,000 tons, while France had a strength of 585,000 tons, the French fleet being less modern than the Italian. This agreement broke down at the last moment because of the Austro-German customs union and Germany's appropriation for a second pocket battleship, March 1931. No evil effects emerged from the breakdown, for both sides continued to act as if it were in force. The London Naval Conference of 1936 was of no significance. In 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria violated the Nine-Power Pacific Treaty of 1922. In 1933, the United States, which had fallen considerably below the level provided in the Washington Agreement of 1922, authorized the construction of 132 vessels to bring its navy to treaty level by 1942. In 1934, Mussolini decided to abandon orthodox financial policies and announced a building program to carry the Italian fleet to treaty level by 1939. This decision was justified by a recent French decision to build two battle cruisers to cope with Germany's three pocket battleships. All these actions were within treaty limitations. In December 1934, however, Japan announced its refusal to renew the existing treaties when they expired in 1936. The Naval Conference called for that date met in the most unfavorable atmosphere. On June 18, 1935, Britain had signed a bilateral agreement with Hitler, which allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of Britain's naval strength in each class and up to 100% in submarines. This was a terrible blow to France, which was limited to 33% of the British navy in capital ships and carriers and had to distribute this lesser fleet on two coasts to deal with Italy as well as Germany, as well as around the world, to protect the French colonial empire. This blow to France was probably the British answer to the French alliance with the Soviet Union, May 2, 1935. The increased German threat on the French northwest coast being intended to deter France from honoring the alliance with the Soviet Union if Germany struck eastward. Thus, France was once again reduced to dependence on Britain. Germany took advantage of this situation to launch 21 submarines by October 1935 and two battleships in 1936. Under these conditions, the Naval Conference at London in 1936 achieved nothing of importance. Japan and Italy refused to sign. As a result, the three signers soon were compelled to use the various escape clauses designed to deal with any extensive building by non-signatory powers. The maximum size of capital ships was raised to 45,000 tons in 1938, and the whole treaty was renounced in 1939. The success achieved in naval disarmaments, limited as it was much greater than the success achieved in respect to other types of armaments, because these require that nations which felt politically insecure must be included in the negotiations. We have already indicated the controversy between the proponents of the direct method and the advocates of the indirect method in disarmament. This distinction was so important that the history of the disarmament of land and air forces can be divided into four periods. A period of direct action, 1919 to 22. B, a period of indirect action, 1922 to 1926. C, a new period of direct action, 1926 to 1934. And D, a period of rearmament, 1934 to 1939. The first period of direct action was based on the belief that the victories of 1918 and the ensuing peace treaties provided security for the victorious powers. Accordingly, the task of reaching a disarmament agreement was turned over to a purely technical group, the Permanent Advisory Commission on Disarmament of the League of Nations. This group, which consisted exclusively of officers of the various armed services, was unable to reach agreement on any important issues. It could not find any method of measuring armaments or even of defining them. It could not distinguish actual from potential armaments or defensive from offensive. It gave answers to some of these questions, but they did not win general assent. For example, it decided that rifles in the possession of troops were war materials, and so also were wood or steel capable of being used to make such rifles, but rifles already made and in storage were not war materials, but inoffensive objects of peace. As a result of the failure of the Permanent Advisory Commission, the Assembly of the League set up a temporary mixed commission on which only 6 of 28 members were officers of the armed services. This body attacked the problem of disarmament by the indirect method, seeking to achieve security before asking anyone to disarm. The Draft Treaty of Mutual Guarantee 1922 and the Geneva Protocol 1924 emerged from this commission. Both of these were, as we have said, vetoed by Britain, so that the disarmament portions of the negotiations were never reached. The achievement of the Locarno Pacts, however, provided in the minds of many the necessary security to allow a return to the direct method. Accordingly, a preparatory commission to the World Disarmament Conference was set up in 1926 to make a draft agreement which was to be completed at a World Disarmament Conference meeting at Geneva in 1932. The Preparatory Commission had delegates from all the important countries of the world, including the defeated powers and the chief non-members of the League. It held 6 sessions over 3 years and drew up 3 drafts. In general, it encountered the same difficulties as the Permanent Advisory Committee. This latter group, acting as a subcommittee of the Preparatory Commission, used up to 3,750,000 sheets of paper in less than 6 months, but still was not able to find answers to the same questions which had baffled it earlier. The chief problems arose from political disputes, chiefly between Britain and France. These two countries produced separate drafts which diverged on almost every point. The French wanted war potential counted, but wanted trained reserves of men excluded from limitation. The British wanted war potential excluded, but wanted to count trained reserves. The French wanted supervision by a permanent commission to enforce fulfillment of any agreement, while the Anglo-Americans refused all supervision. Eventually, a draft was prepared by including all divergences in parallel columns.